Hello, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Jordan Finken, the Rare Book and Manuscript Librarian here at the Cloud Library, one of the world's premier Judaica libraries, to which I would like to welcome you. I'm especially pleased to introduce today's speaker because you're in for a treat. Christopher Platts is a professor of art history and University Research Council scholar at the University of Cincinnati. His work focuses on medieval and Renaissance European art, especially late medieval Italian painting and manuscript illumination. In addition to his award-winning teaching and research, he is also an accomplished curator. Indeed, I had the great pleasure of seeing his Rediscovering Catherina van Hemessen, Scourging of Christ, Women Artists, Patrons, and Rulers in Renaissance Europe exhibit and curatorial discussion at UC. Here in the library, we so often devote ourselves to the contents that we can easily overlook the containers. The images that appear in so many of our manuscripts and early printed books can, of course, be appreciated for their decorative value. But sometimes in doing so, the role of those images in the meaning of the text gets obscured. In the margins does not always mean marginalized. That is why I am so pleased that Professor Platts, in focusing on the creatures that haunt or inhabit our books, will bring his art historical expertise to bear on the integration of imagery into the artifact of the book and manuscript. I will also note that accompanying this talk is a collaborative exhibit between the Cloud Library and the John Miller Burnham Classics Library of the University of Cincinnati, which I encourage you to peruse at your leisure after the lecture. And I am grateful to the Classics Library as well as to Abigail Bacon for making that a reality. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Platts and his talk, Creatures in Medieval and Early Modern Books, Forms, Functions, and Artistic Fantasy.
Ready to go presentation?
Thank you very much, Jordan, for that introduction. Just give me a moment while Abigail pulls up.
Always turn your mic on.
Can you guys hear me okay?
No.
Oh. The mic is on. I can also speak louder.
Speak louder.
Speak louder. All right. So thank you very much. As Jordan said, my presentation is Creatures in Medieval and Early Modern Books, Forms, Function, and Artistic Fantasy. And I wanted to do a few things before I delve into the objects themselves. And I'm so happy to be placed right here with the exhibition just behind me. One of my favorite things to do, other than give lectures, is to give gallery talks. I've worked in museums most of my career. And one of the things I'm going to do today, rather than read from a script during this lecture, is to speak a little bit more freely, a little bit more off script based on the images I'm going to show you and some of the prompts that I've given myself. My hope is that I can make these images and I can make these books come alive for you, at least in reproduction, and encourage you to spend more time as well on the actual objects afterwards. So this lecture is really an introduction and overview and a delving into the exhibition, Tales of Imaginary Creatures in Medieval and Renaissance Rare Books and Manuscripts. And I'm so happy to see this collaboration between the Cloud Library and the Burnham Library of Classics at the University of Cincinnati. I think Jordan already mentioned Abigail and Dr. Rebecca Lindau, who's in charge of the Burnham Library. And I just wanted to make a plug for the exhibition. You probably already know this because you can see it. But there are about 30 different objects on display: manuscripts, printed books with illustrations, ancient coins, scrolls, as well as a few deluxe facsimiles of books, unique books in the world for which we have these wonderful, high-quality representations. And I just wanted to say again, this collaboration between the University of Cincinnati and the Hebrew Union College is important to me because I've benefited a great deal in my teaching and in my research, as I'll say in a moment. Before I get into it, I wanted to slightly embarrass Jordan with maybe not embarrass, praise Jordan. There's a picture of him here teaching one of my courses on medieval art history or Renaissance art history from the Verniger Miscellany, which is one of the manuscripts I'll talk about. I first learned about it from Jordan. We've probably made 3 or 4 art history class visits here, thanks to Jordan and Abigail. And I also want to say, with the Classics Library at UC and Rebecca Lindau, I take my classes there. The highlights of this semester on the student evaluations are those trips to come look at the books that Jordan and Rebecca share with us in their respective libraries. So these vital collaborations are important to me. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Abby Schwartz and taking trips to the Skirball Museum for the same reasons. So I'm very happy to be here and to share what I have to say based on first learning about so many of these books from the colleagues in the audience. For this lecture, as I mentioned already today, I'm not going to speak from the script. I'd like it to be slightly more informal. I'm going to really delve into images on the screen. But my goals today are to give you a quick overview and an introduction to some of the highlights and some of the things I find interesting about those manuscripts, the text and image relationships, why certain creatures and certain things are deployed in the margins, in central locations, in prominent spaces within the books. I want to show you where, why, and how illustrators or illuminators, sometimes the scribes themselves were these figures, sometimes there was a division of labor, how they deploy these images and what potential meanings they may have been going after. I should preface this, or I should offer a warning that so much of the hypotheses and proposals are just those. We don't often know why artists put certain things in margins, for instance, but we can think about it together. And it's a wonderful thing to discuss, at least among art historians, trying to figure out why certain hybrids, certain strange creatures inhabit certain places. Ultimately, what I'd like to do through the series of examples I show you of Jewish and Christian books and secular books is propose that the artists, whether they were following specific instructions from a scribe or the patron, the client who's paying for the manuscript, they could exercise their creativity and their imagination, whether they were telling the story or illustrating the text straightforwardly, more elusively, or with more kind of indirect associations, or if they were being entirely whimsical, if they were using their imagination and fantasy simply to decorate the book willy-nilly as they liked. We'll look at examples that run the gamut, and in certain cases where I don't have a clue as to why certain things are featured, perhaps many of you will. One important thing to note, my background is in art history. I'm not a religious studies scholar. I don't read Hebrew, so I've relied greatly on Abigail and Jordan for help with the texts in which the images closely interact. So forgive me for the mistakes that I made. If you have questions regarding the text, I'll do my best, but I might have to defer to others. But I just wanted to make sure upfront, you know, that my background is really in late medieval and Renaissance illuminated manuscripts, Western Central European, mostly Christian and secular. These are text-heavy slides at the beginning. We'll get to the pictures, but I wanted to have us all on the same page with some basic information about the types of books in this exhibition. My subtitle has forms, functions, and fantasy in it when we're thinking about these creatures. The forms are those creatures we'll talk about that are either factual or fantastic. The functions are why they were put, where they were put. And the fantasy is really the most interesting part of the talk, I think. Thinking about artists, their imagination, their ideas, and what they can bring to these texts. In terms of the media and techniques, I'll be using a couple terms. I just wanted to throw them out there in the beginning. Most of the illuminated and illustrated manuscripts are on parchment or paper. We have different kinds of ink, colors, pigments, and gold. The division of labor, this is an important point I wanted to make. Ultimately, the content of a book is going to be dictated by the patron, the client, the person who's paying for it. The scribe will, of course, be the one who includes or adds those texts. And then if there is a division of labor, if the scribe is only a scribe and not also an artist, then you might have an illustrator and possibly even an illuminator. The distinction there, the illustrator is one who might, for instance, do the contours, the outline of objects, of creatures. The illuminator, if you think of the root of the word light, the illuminator is adding the bright colors, especially the gold leaf or the gold pigment. So sometimes we'll have a division of labor and just a kind of a division between these figures. In one really famous, great example that Jordan has written about and spoken about, which we'll talk about, we can find a scribe who's also an illuminator, who's very self-conscious about his artistic and scribal authority. And that's one of the great examples in the Vernacular Codex that we'll talk about. Chronologically, we're in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. Examples other than the ancient coins run from about 1000 to 1900 of the Common Era. And of course, we're talking about religious and secular books, Christian and Jewish books, excuse me. And we'll think also about readers and users and viewers of the manuscripts, because there's some really great examples where we can get physical traces in the book that show us how a reader was making changes, making additions, reacting to the text and the images. So thinking about a book codichologically as a physical material object, which I love to do, and I know Jordan does as well, and that's one of the things I really love about book history. I've spoken for a long time, so I want to get to my first example. I have about 7 or 8 examples of books from both the Cloud Library and the Burnham Library. And I'm going to try to limit myself to a couple minutes. And what I want to do is show you and describe each book before I get into some art historical analysis. So even though it's just behind me, up here, I'm showing you here Cloud Library MS 2102. This is an opening from this wonderful book. This is the Muzanama. It's a cycle of Moses's heroic trials. It's based on a 14th century Judeo-Persian poem by the author Shahin. What we're looking at is a late 19th century copy of this text that's been illustrated. And the opening that the curators have for our book, and our book is a fragment, rather than having the first, rather than having the entire Pentateuch, we have just Exodus and Deuteronomy. We are looking at Deuteronomy chapter 3, in which Moses is fighting against and defeating the last giant, Og of Bashan, king of the Amorites. This battle was mentioned not only in Deuteronomy, but actually throughout, throughout the Bible. And what's interesting about this, in this first example, which is more or less straightforward, is the artist is illustrating the text in a pretty straightforward manner. I'm going to describe it for a moment before I go into detail, but I'd like you to notice a few things about this opening. The first is that there is some damage right here in the legs of Og, who was a giant, some 13 feet tall. His size is known or is calculated based on a description of his bed. He slept on an iron bed, 13 cubits long and 6 cubits wide. I'll tell you more about him. Moses is here with a nimbus or a halo. He has a stick with which he will defeat Og. And just look for a moment before I go into detail. What I'd like you to pay attention to is the layout of the page. We have the text, some more of the text here, as well as the large scale illustration. Here is a good example where the illustration is given almost as much real estate, so to speak, as the text itself. Before I go into that image, I just want to say that some of the relationships I'll talk about today are the image as a straightforward illustration of the text, the image being associated with, loosely or roughly, the text. Images where the artist has taken simple verbal cues from the text, a single word, a phrase, and then made a drawing, made a painting. And then images entirely fantastical, images entirely unmoored from the textual contents itself. Some of the things that we'll keep in mind, and again, I throw a lot of information at you at first, but I hope to exemplify or demonstrate all of these. Artists were working within visual traditions, so there's certain images that almost always illustrated certain stories, but that doesn't mean that the artist doesn't have a certain amount of freedom. That is to say, they can tell the story how they wish with their own pictorial rhetoric. That is how they're going to tell a convincing and action-packed or dynamic story. And that's what we'll talk about in just a second with Moses. I also want to stress the fact that there is lots of room for creativity within images that just directly illustrate a story. So going to our first example, coming back to our first example, I want us to look for a moment at the way in which Og himself is shown here. His red skirt or his red clothes, they actually touch and go beyond the red border of the image. He almost reaches the top, almost reaches the bottom, in a way that Moses does not. Even though it's a minor detail, approaching and reaching borders was one of the ways that artists could express certain ideas. So to get his gigantic stature, not just the relationship between Og and Moses, but also the fact that he's right up against the border. He's right where the green grass of the image almost meets the text. Usually important figures, whether in Christian or Jewish art, could be hierarchically sized. The more important figures might be larger than other figures because of their importance. But that is certainly not the case here, where Moses is rather diminutive in comparison to Og. The other interesting thing, if you go back to the observation, the damage at his feet looks like it was water or some liquid that spilled. Abigail, if it's possible to think. You can see on the opposite page the offset. That is, when this was wet, that pigment came here. You can see that. And that damage actually left space where his left foot was. And this mark here is something like a caret. It's like an indication because Og's name is written just below his left leg. And so here we have the relation between text and image pretty straightforwardly. Typically in manuscripts, the text described as his work first, the text is written first, and then the illustrator or illuminator comes afterwards. And so it's interesting that we have Og right beneath his left foot, but it's a later reader, someone who, after this book was damaged, after it was first created, included this indicator of the name. The reason I dwell on this for a moment is the second observation that I find really interesting, which is if you look again at the whole opening, we saw that there's an offset. Some of the damage when this was wet came here. But look at the damage on Og's face. It's been rubbed, it's been abraded, but there's no offset on this page. There wasn't water damage here that when the book was later closed appeared here. And so what this suggests to me is that a reader at one point or another vandalized, took away the power of Og in the way that is quite common in Christian medieval, Renaissance, early modern manuscripts, but for which, since I'm still learning more about the physical use and later history of Jewish manuscripts, I don't have other examples. But I think there's a good chance that a reader, recognizing Og as the last of the giants, defeated by Moses with the power of God in one of the most important battles in Deuteronomy, was probably vandalized by a reader, especially taking out the eyes and the face, the source of power, the source of life. And so I find that really interesting, and it just happens to occur on a page where we can see other damage that was clearly an accident. In this case, it doesn't appear to be so. One of the other things I wanted to mention, it's not just a straightforward image that illustrates the text. The artist has a certain rhetoric. In the text itself, we learn that Moses grabs a stake and with the divine power of God is able to kill this giant. And so his nimbus, his symbol of divine favor and power, the stick goes right through it, and it also goes right to the edge, as if it can't be contained by the border. In the same way that to express the gigantism of this figure, his skirt touches. But this weapon that will defeat Og has God's power. It's not just Moses, and the artist has clearly made that, to me, clearly made that by having it go through the halo and the tension of it about to strike the angle, which will kill Og in this story. So I want to say that there is room for the artist to tell the story and to have details like this, which were probably closely considered. I don't think it's happenstance that it touches the red border, that it touches the halo of Moses. I can speak about these images for a long time, so I'm going to speak up. All right, I want to be sure to discuss secular and Christian books as well, as much as I really enjoy the books from the Cloud Library that I've been learning about. But again, I'm going to speed up a bit. You're looking here at an edition of Ovid's Metamorphoses from 1701. You're looking at a title page of this famous ancient Roman book that essentially tells 250 myths from ancient Greece and Rome, from the beginning of the world up until the present day, some of the most popular myths. And I just want to focus on the fact that we're looking at a title page, so not a particular text, as we were with Moses' Battle of Og. And so we're looking at the illustration accompanying it. So within this book are contained numerous myths, and some of the most famous, tantalizing, myths are shown in this one pictorial space. Some of the most famous that you might be familiar with, Apollo, the god chasing Daphne, who at the last moment prays to her father to be saved. Daphne here is turned into a laurel tree. You can see a trunk where her body is. You can see the branches. Her father here is the river god Manus, who saves her from Apollo's advances. So Apollo and Daphne, or Actaeon, the hunter who mistakenly comes upon the goddess Diana in her bath and sees her bathing naked. Diana turns him into a stag so that his own hunting dogs maul and kill, which is here. And you can see other intriguing popular stories. The Sphinx throws herself off a cliff, and at the very end of Ovid's book, he praises and deifies Julius Caesar, who's probably depicted here. So even though these are illustrations of stories, there is a great deal of artistic creativity. In this case, it's bringing them all together in a single pictorial space, sometimes in a good way, that is a successful way, other times, for instance, to my eye, not very successfully. So for instance, I have a lot of trouble reading this passage, Daphne turning into a tree, but there's also a winged bird-headed figure here and a centaur, half horse, half man here. I have a lot of trouble reading that. This artist has nowhere given himself or herself credit. Even all the text within the title page and within this scroll. So it's probably a very middling, mediocre artist. I shouldn't be too harsh. I'm not. I'm an imposter at the College of DAAP. I'm a historian. I have no creativity, which is always an embarrassment when I meet someone in Cincinnati. Because they say, "Oh, you're a DAAP. You must be an artist or architect." But I did want to mention that there is some other, not just the creativity of fitting these interesting creatures into this one teaser, that you should read this book because you'll learn about these. But it is interesting that the artist, the designer of this engraving, that is, puts this floating page within the page of the book itself. This idea of picture within picture or build in build. And to do that, it's giving more fame. This is fame, fama, with the trumpet. Giving fame to the author Ovid, but also there's an annotator who's given credit, and then the publisher and a few other things. And so it's interesting to think that we have this long practice of the artist referencing his or her own work that we're going to see again in the Werner Codex. Excuse me. I think I've said more or less everything I was going to. But again, I'm starting with the simplest relationships with images illustrating texts, images that get a lot of space in the book, usually a full page illustration for a title page or for a text. So I want to move to one of my favorite objects in the exhibition, the opening book, one of my favorite openings, excuse me. What we're looking at here is MS 905, and it is a book that contains treatises on the calendar and reckoning certain days, holidays, and seasons, as well as several glossaries. But I'm going to focus on one of the openings in which we see this zodiacal sign, Aquarius. I'm just going to describe it for you here. What we see on the right-hand page is a merman pouring from a vessel water. You might have trouble seeing it, but there's the sun, the moon, and stars inside of this round plant-like form. And a lot of these details are going to be interesting in relation to the text on the left. So Aquarius is associated with the month of Shabbat. And in this text, in this calendrical text, we have all of the important biblical events that occurred during this month, that are said to have occurred in the Bible during this month. And the text begins in the upper left. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. We have the text on the left, and again, here we have an image given a full page. But we're not looking at a straightforward illustration. And I just want to describe the manuscript. I had to actually do a bit more research, but it's really for calculating Jewish holidays and reconciling the solar and lunar calendars in a way that you can deal with leap years and kind of reckon certain dates.
What year?
Oh, I'm sorry. Should introduce the manuscript. Thank you. It's known to be before 1624, so it's probably late 16th or early 17th century, but I'm not sure stylistically. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that it looks like this merman is looking upwards towards the text. And that's important for how I read it. But first, a few more details. The words that are written within the image. The Hebrew word for bucket is here above this vessel. The Hebrew word for merman is here above the figure himself. And the very first words on the page that he's looking up at, so the very first words right here, are when Noah left the ark. And this is a wonderful coincidence wherein we have Aquarius and we have the story of Noah. And so if you think of the story of Noah, of the flood, the rushing water, and then later the receding water when he's leaving the ark, it just so happens that we have here a sea creature who's pouring out a vessel that has a quite vigorous rush of water that comes out. More generally, not just related to Noah, the idea of these circles, which actually encompass all of the zodiacal creatures, the idea of time flowing, is kind of a universal symbol. And then the fact that this particular circle, because the other zodiac symbols have them as well, has plant forms. So if we think about Noah leaving the ark and his sacrifice, and then God's promise to him about repopulating the earth and Noah becoming fruitful and having access to food and plants, there are things here that in the story could have prompted the illustrator and illuminator to make this image in this way. So here I want to make a small distinction from the types of images we looked at so far and say that this image, the zodiac, is not mentioned. Aquarius is not mentioned in the text on the left-hand page. So it's really associated with the text by a long visual tradition. So other calendrical treatises in the Jewish tradition have the signs of the zodiac. So it's a visual tradition, but there's no one-to-one relationship with what's mentioned in the text. And I couldn't help myself with a quick excursus. I'm sorry that this is blurry, but please come up afterwards and look at the quality and, for me, the artistic vigor or expressivity of the original. And this doesn't do it justice, but I thought of Leonardo's famous drawing of a deluge, which is in Windsor Castle. And it's one of the most reproduced Leonardo drawings. And the energy here, it's blurry, but there's a wonderful expressivity and energy in this, as if the moment when God releases the waters and causes the flood is happening, in the way that here Leonardo imagines it in a secular drawing. And so it's just a wonderful artistic representation. I think it's that artistic license to be expressive. All right, so we did one from the Clow Library, now one from the Classics Library, the Burnham Library. One of my favorites, and I'm so pleased that Dr. Lindau has been acquiring manuscript leaves for teaching and research. What you're looking at here is a single leaf from a book of hours, a private prayer book that was quite common in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. It was the proverbial bestseller for Christians in Europe who could afford it. This page illustrated the office of the dead, or the office for the dead. However, the manuscript was unfinished. The text actually would have been right here. I'm going to describe the image before I go into detail. What you see is death personified as a skeleton, carrying a gigantic arrow and menacing this woman right here, whose body is kind of gracefully retreating, moving away from death atop this angry bull. Two dead bodies here have already been either killed by arrows or trampled. It's not an uncommon image for the office of the dead, but it's one of several. And this is from about 1490 in France. And actually, I'll back up for a second, because the same artistic vigor that I saw in the merman, I see also here, there's some wonderful highlights that individuate the ribs of the skeleton. White strokes of paint atop the gray body of the skeleton, or even the white small single brush or single hair strokes that create his hair. It's really a lively image, much nicer than many of the others from the period. Here's a good example where we have not only an image that is associated with the very text, it's not directly in the office for the dead. The office for the dead doesn't mention a skeleton atop a bull with an arrow. So I'm going to speak not about visual tradition, that is, there is a tradition of this image associated with the text, but more important, if we think about verbal cues, words in the text itself that inspired some of the first artists who had to decorate this part of this book. Where did they get this idea of death personified? And so a couple snippets from the Office for the Dead. The sorrows of death have compassed me, the pains of hell have found me. And then a little bit later, the sharp arrows of the mighty of God may be given to you. And so even if this artist is working in 1490 and there are images like this 100, 200 years earlier, we can think about some of the verbal cues in the text that led to the first instances of this iconography. And so this idea that an artist could invent a scene or take a scene and have it be appropriate based on just a couple words or ideas in a text is important for the other books we'll look at. There were a variety of images that could go here. You might see a funeral, you might see a body being buried. Those are much more common for the Office for the Dead in books of hours of this period. You might just see a skeleton, but in this case, we have this really vigorous narrative. Think about the huge arrow, this diagonal that creates the dynamism of this composition, and then the skeleton body itself. Kind of these diagonals are what create a dynamic composition in art as opposed to a stable vertical or horizontal. All right, and I couldn't help myself. I wanted to do one more excursus. This is also on display. So I've juxtaposed here the image from the Office of the Dead with a representation from early 16th century commentary on Sebastian Brandt's Ship of Fools, an important secular text. I show it because one of the great artists of the Western tradition, HUC-JIR, a printmaker and painter from Nuremberg, is thought to have, in his youth, in the 1490s, he made the wood blocks that were then used again and again, even in 1511. This is a representation of superbia, of pride, of vanity. And so this is known colloquially in scholarship as the vanity fool. Here you have a series of different fools in this book and their foolish behavior satirized, mocked. Here she is looking at a mirror, entirely unaware that there's a demon or a devil behind her, roasting her over a fire. She has no clue. Her face is represented in the mirror. And so I just wanted to show this because it's from about the same time. Durer makes the woodblock in 1494. And it's just interesting because it's on display behind us. And again, we have not death personified, but perhaps a demon or a little devil. And then we have also a beautiful woman in the newest fashions. In this case, this woman is afraid, but death comes for us all. In this case, if she were not so vain, could perhaps last a little bit longer. All right, so I want to get increasingly more subtle examples. And so one of the treasures of the Cloud Library, or one of the great things are looking at the Esther scrolls, which are, of course, again, is done with Dr. Finken many times. So the object that's in the display behind me is Scrolls 56, and it's open to most of what is chapter 2 of Esther. And so we're going to focus on a few of the images within this column to the right of the text, and then a few of the images in the upper border. But you can see that there are animals, there are plants, there are figures, and I have a few more details in the next slide. But here is a unicorn. Here is an enthroned king with a scepter. So we'll talk about those. Let me place the object for you, sorry. It's Central European, possibly from Vienna in the 18th century, and it's ink on parchment. So I want to show you a few details, a few more. Up here, we have a standing man holding the book, as well as two entwined herons. And again, we've seen these figures before, and here's the whole page, just so you can get a context of where you are. And so I wanted to look at the way in which these figures are placed, because if in this scroll, on every section of the scroll, there's a column of figures. There are figures in the upper and lower margins, and figuring out if they have any relevance to the text, whether directly, loosely, symbolically. metaphorically, is an interesting exercise. And so I've been trying to do this by looking at some of the scholarship, modern day scholarship, by Jewish art historians and religious studies scholars on animals and their possible significances in texts and in sculpture and architecture as well. So here we're talking again about verbal cues for the artist, the illustrator. And again, I say illustrator here because we have pen and ink drawings, no color. So just a matter of terminology. So the first example, this man standing with a book here is standing over Esther, chapter 2, verse 5. Now in Shushan the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai. And so sometimes you have a straightforward or seemingly straightforward representation. This makes sense that it's Mordecai. He's holding a book. Mordecai was part of the Sanhedrin and I guess a legal and judicial official or scholar. If we look at these two here as well, here the enthroned king, as you might expect, is Ahasuerus, and forgive me, Ahasuerus. All over it. When the king's decree was heard, Esther was brought also unto the king's house. This text, Esther 2:8, actually occurs lower down here. So there's no text directly next to the king on either side. But here there's kind of a loose visual or loose association of another hero of the story or major character of the story. Now, the most interesting for me is this unicorn right here. And the horn of the unicorn actually points to Esther's name. And so we have the verse from chapter 2, verse 7, and he brought up Hadassah, and please again forgive my pronunciation, that is Esther, and the maid was fair and beautiful. And in this case, the horn itself is a deictic, it's an indicator. It points to the text, the specific text, which is really interesting. Other instances here, a lion rampant, a fox, a dog chasing a hare, a stork with a snake in its mouth. There are no clear verbal cues from this text, reading the text, but there are other possibilities. And so I'm just going to mention a few based on some of the ideas that I've seen proposed for some of these visual paintings. We saw Mordecai with the book, we saw King Ahasuerus. The idea of Esther associated with a unicorn is an interesting one. For me, I thought right away, casting a wide net, even though it's irrelevant, to how Esther is seen in the Christian tradition. She's a prefiguration of the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary is often associated with unicorns. The Virgin in the Christian tradition is the only person who can tame a unicorn. And so the unicorn, according to Christian exegesis, is Christ. And oftentimes in Christian art, we have hunts of unicorns in which various people hunt the unicorn representing the passion and death of Christ. But the Virgin is associated with unicorns, and Esther is a prefiguration in Christian exegesis of the Virgin. None of that is relevant in this case. So what I did find is that the instances in which unicorns are mentioned in Agadic literature, again, forgive my pronunciation, Agadic literature, they are seen as swift and free, beautiful and proud creatures. And more specifically, there is an interpretation that they are relevant to a messianic redemptive mood that's appropriate for Esther. That goes back to a really detailed explanation that Adam sacrificed a one-horned beast, a unicorn, after his first night, after he was created. He made the sacrifice in thanks for being alive after his first night when darkness came and we thought darkness would never go away. That same spot where that happened, again, according to the Jewish interpretation, is where Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac, where Solomon's temple was located, and several other important things happened. And it's based on this chain of associations that scholars today associate Esther with the unicorn and the story of Esther with redemption. So it's not, as much as I may have just made it sound like a reach, a more eloquent scholar would make the book. A few other things. The dog hunting a rabbit. Sorry, the detail was not great. This is not uncommon representation of the persecution of the Jews by stronger nations in many types of Jewish books. But again, it also appears in many other contexts. So again, it's an association, but it's not the strongest. A stork with a snake in its mouth. Again, this is also in other examples of Jewish iconography, an example of piety oppressing evil. And here I think it's etymological, sometimes the argument. So the idea, again, of a stork, Hasidah, as a symbol of piousness, or of the pious Hasid. And so some of these might relate to the full story of Esther and the salvation of the Jewish people. All right, I'm going to speed up. I want to show very briefly Pliny the Elder, the ancient Roman Pliny the Elder, the encyclopedist, his natural history. And the book on display behind me is open to the 10th book of Pliny on the nature and the natural history of birds. In this encyclopedia, Pliny covers everything in the world and describes it and explains it in a nice order. We're looking at a 1513 edition from Venice, one of the first, if not the first, printed illustrated editions. The woodcuts were designed by a famous Venetian artist, Benedetto Bordone. I'm sorry for the photographs here with the glass and the reflections. But what I want to show you is at the top of this book, again, the book dedicated to birds. The very first section of the book deals with the ostrich and how stupid it is, and why Christians collect ostrich eggs and put them in their churches. But there's no illustration of the ostrich. Instead, the major illustration is of the phoenix, which is the second bird actually described. What you're looking at is a woodcut miniature, and then a first initial S that begins the book itself, which I show right here. So when you read the text, it makes perfect sense that you would have a phoenix represented if you're talking about a phoenix on the same page, but there's no mention, and I actually don't understand this, perhaps you can help me. A phoenix, the idea that this bird lives 500 plus years, and then when it's about to die, it creates a nest of sweet smelling plants of incense, and it goes and it dies and it bursts into flames from which a worm comes alive and then turns into a small phoenix that then grows and matures. What you see here appears to be a mature or old phoenix. And then here is a fire, and here's perhaps the new phoenix. But there's a woman here within the flames. I don't understand. I read the text. I'm not sure what she represents. But at the very least, the phoenix is shown here, and the idea of the fire, which creates a new phoenix. This legendary bird, which, at least according to the author in ancient Rome and then the editor in 1513, only one had ever been seen. What I want to look at actually is what the artist decided to do with the initials, because the first initial of each book is different. And in this case, the fact that the chapter speaks about birds was the inspiration of the images, I think, for including a dragon here, as well as these winged cherubs, these winged butti, these little children with wings, which are so common in the Italian Renaissance art. They're playing with the letter S. This one seems to be seeing how sharp it is. This one seems to be stroking the neck of the dragon. This playfulness is an important theme because the whimsical, fanciful drawings that we'll see in the margins and that we're starting to see here, this is an example of them. And to put a dragon, to put little cherubs, they have no place in the text of Pliny. They're nowhere mentioned. So it itself is playful. It's artistically playful, and it's really riffing on birds, because here you have winged humans or winged children, and you have dragons who are not mentioned by Pliny. So we start to see not only verbal cues from the text for the phoenix, even if parts of it are unexplained, but also artistic fancy for the sake of delighting, bringing visual pleasure to the reader. All right, I'm going to come to my last example here, which is one of the most magnificent books, this medieval miscellany, a compilation of different kinds of books. It's called the Vernigerode Miscellany. It has biblical and legal texts, among other things, a Pentateuch, a prayer book, and 3 works of Jewish law and custom. I know that Dr. Finken has lectured and written about this book before. It's probably familiar to many of you. I'm going to focus in on one or two things about it. But to give you the context, it comes from Wernigerode, Germany. It's dated by the Colophon, 1393. We actually know the name of the scribe, Abraham van Samuel of Wernigerode, and we know that he made this book for his uncle Israel. Information. We wish we had this for every book. It's kind of Colophon. I'm showing you just the opening that's on display here. What you see is this fortified castle gateway towers. The initial word panel here, which I'll go into in a moment. Two in the spandrels of this arch, two representations of three hares, three rabbits that are running in a circle that actually have only three ears. They share ears in a kind of a mystical puzzle that is from ancient times and globally seen globally all around the world. And then, of course, the two intertwined dragons, the next intertwined underneath the gateway, outside of the gateway, and then perhaps two birds right here. Before I start to analyze this particular opening and how image and text might relate to each other, I have to preface that discussion with this wonderful representation of the scribe himself. So here is Abraham ben Samuel on another page. He depicts, well, let me start with the text itself. So the name Abraham within the text appears, and I would argue that the scribe himself, who was also the illustrator, at least here, decided to image himself. Here he is carrying his book and pointing to this little floral embellishment to Abraham. He points at his own name. This is me. This is Abraham. This is artistic or scribal self-consciousness, self-awareness. And this is not uncommon in the late Middle Ages. It's not uncommon in the High Middle Ages earlier on, and even in antiquity. And I'll explain that in a moment. But the reason I dwell on this for a moment is here we know that in this book, the scribe is also the artist, or at least one of the artists, and that there is a particularly subtle or sensitive relationship between image and text, just by this one demonstration where, again, Abraham is a verbal cue to say, here's my self-portrait, here's my portrait. Here's the quick digression to an amazingly virtually contemporary image of a Christian, an Augustinian friar named Pietro da Pavia, in a manuscript dated 1389, now in Milan. We have this Augustinian friar who places his self-portrait, in this case, in an initial, but it's not just any initial. He chooses the initial that begins book 35 of Pliny's Natural History. Remember, we talked about Pliny a moment ago. This is an encyclopedia. When you get to book 35, you're not in birds, you're in artists from antiquity. So he has very self-consciously placed himself at the chapter that mentions the most famous artists of antiquity who did the Apollo Belvedere, or name your Vatican treasures. And so he is promoting himself and saying, I belong here with the greatest antiquity. Not only that, he signs Frater Petrus da Pavia, and he dates it 1389. I'm sorry for the reproduction. But that's amazing. 4 years separate these, Christian and Jew. It's very self-conscious, and there are different motivations. And this is actually what my work is mostly about in this period. I think about text and image, and I look at artist signatures and how they relate to their paintings, sculptures, architecture, and books. So I love this kind of thing, and I love thinking about what are the motives underlying these. What could we possibly say? But in this case, we know his colophon was writing for a famous humanist who reads and wants to know about Pliny. And he is putting himself there and hoping that his patron will share that manuscript with other people and he'll get more jobs. He's promoting himself as a great artist. At the same time, he was a friar, he was a religious man, an Augustinian. And so motives of devotion and prayer, oftentimes artists would sign their works and consider their work the work of God, Opus Dei in the Christian tradition. And so to put their name down in the year, it's not just a matter of artistic pride in what has been accomplished, but also a matter of dedicating one's work to the Lord. So it's interesting to think about those kinds of motives. by digression, I should go back to what we're supposed to talk about, which is creatures. So my last example on my last page, probably the most complicated or among them. And here I want to talk about not just about verbal cues, but artistic imagination. So this castle gate with towers, it marks a division in this text. Remember, it's a text with miscellaneous books. So if we look at the full opening, this gate marks the division. Here begin the morning blessings on waiting. So the gate itself marks a division, and this is important because the Hebrew word jar for gate is also the same word as title page. And so not only is this a gate, but it's a title page. It's the page that leads into or begins the next text. So here, the idea of a gateway leading to a new book makes perfect sense. And throughout this miscellany, when a new major text begins, elaborate gateway, but not necessarily dragons, hares, birds, and so on. The initial word panel, by which I mean this right here, is blessed. Blessed are you, Lord, which begins the first of the three morning blessings, is right here. So it's kind of the strong horizontal part of the gate itself. It's well advertised, it's prominent. The intertwined dragons are interesting, and there are many ways that we could interpret them. They appear, intertwined dragons, in many Pentateuchs, and they appear also in many other Hebrew manuscripts. Sometimes you might think of them as symbols of evil or chaos, based on connections with the Bible itself. However, they can also be seen as apotropaic, that is, they can be seen as protecting against evil spirits coming in. If we look at their location, they're outside the gate. They don't directly overlap it or include it, but they seem to be outside if we think of this as a pictorial space. If you think of the text within this book, the religious text as sacred, as a sacred space, a sacred realm that you're entering into through this gate as a reader. The dragons are on the outside and you're going into it. You're moving through the gate and the dragons are outside of it. So we can think of them also as liminal creatures who inhabit that threshold space, who don't actually enter into it. At the same time, you can see that they're not even fighting. Their heads go towards their own body. Yes, they look scary, but are they even a threat? Again, there's no one answer, and I actually haven't found any scholars who treat this particular example. There are lots of examples of dragons where they're literally compressed by the gate, as if the gate itself is subduing, which in a way that makes sense. If they're evil and chaos and symbols of disorder, the text will do that. In this case, that I don't think that is the case. I think they're outside and you're entering it. The three hares in a circle I've not seen actual scholarship. I've just seen blog entries trying to figure it out, but they appear since late antiquity in China and India in Christian, Jewish, Buddhist iconography. They're interesting. Sometimes they're thought to be visual puzzles. How could three hares, I don't have a detail, but they share 3 ears because they're overlapping. The idea of trying to understand this puzzle, perhaps trying to understand Jewish religious text, the way you see a squirrel trying to eat a nut, trying to get to trying to figure out or get through the difficulty of a text to its end. But again, there's no one interpretation. None of these birds know what to do. Anyways, you've kindly listened to me for a long time. I hope I've shown you a couple of examples of different ways that the artists have deployed creatures and objects in interesting ways in relation to text, whether directly, indirectly, metaphorically, or with no relation to the text whatsoever. I really encourage you, if you have time, to spend with the objects themselves as much as you can. And yeah, I wish to thank you for the opportunity to speak.
So obviously, thank you. This was just not only fascinating, but a lot of fun. It was fun for me. But with your indulgence, if we'd like to invite questions, should you have any, so please feel free. And just given the nature of the sound, if you would just recapitulate the question so that online they'll have a.
Absolutely. Please.
How much do you think speed of production was a factor in making like these designs?
I think you have to take it case by case basis. And you have to think about if it's a manuscript or a printed book. Are there particular designs that caught your eye where you're interested? Maybe they were doing it really fast, so they did it this way, or
Yeah,
is there a good example? we can zoom in on?
the giant and Moses.
Abigail, are we able
Oh, I'm
to see
sorry.
the presentation?
Yes.
Oh,
I
I
can
need
get-
to reiterate the question, I'm sorry. Was the speed of production, or could the speed of production of these books or manuscripts have impacted the representations? I hope I didn't butcher your question.
No, it's good.
If there's a way, Abigail, to look at the.
Oh, is that
presentation,
not
yes.
shared? Okay,
Oh,
hold
it's
on.
not. But so speaking about Moses and the giant, that's a great question. Just thinking about it, maybe I can look at the real thing for a moment. The hard part is you have to realize that artists of different calibers are working. So in this case, for instance, you have to think about, naturally they would have been, they're working for contract, they're working for money, they want to get the job done, and they want to get the job done adequately. And so the question of quality is an interesting one. But I think, as I mentioned before, I think there's certain things in this image which point to the artist actually taking time to think, not just, I need Moses and a giant, and Moses has to have a stick, but the fact that Moses, I spoke about his halo and his stick approaching that border, and the stick kind of getting divine power from the halo. I think that the artist in this case actually was looking at, or at least read the text to see that only with God's divine help is Moses able to strike down this giant. And I think that the artist would have seen the text and they would have seen that they had this much space. And so they probably would have taken the time to think that the giant really needs to approach the full borders of the image, and that Moses, even though he's a much more important, obviously holy figure, he's going to be small here because the story is about Moses and the giant. And I wouldn't be doing my job as an illustrator if I showed a giant who slept in an iron bed of 13 cubits smaller than Moses. So I think each is case by case, and there's a lot of hypothetical thinking or speculative thinking, as I'm doing right now. But the best that we can do is use the images as visual evidence with as much scrutiny as we might use the text as textual evidence, or at least with more scrutiny than we might think. It's not just an illustration, it's always an interpretation, whether they have a little bit of time or a lot of time, the illustrators to make it. So it's a great question. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. This was a great lecture. I'm curious, so there's sort of this debate, or it's more or less a settled debate in medieval Jewish history, but traditionally there was kind of this idea that Jews were in this kind of hermetically sealed space and what have you, culturally. And I'm just curious, as somebody who's kind of approaching this material, as somebody who's more trained in the Christian tradition, obviously so much of this, we see some shared imagery and what have you. Is there anything that you see where artists in Jewish manuscripts seem to be approaching visual images differently or using images to convey something different? Or do you really see that basically this is part and parcel of the shared world between Jewish and Christian?
That's a great question. I'm just gonna try to paraphrase it. Are there examples in the Jewish visual tradition where Jewish artists are really doing something very specifically Jewish and not necessarily drawing on a shared visual culture with Christians and others? It's a great question. My teaching and my own interest is really looking at parts of Europe like Spain, where we tend to have this shared visual culture that both Christians and Jews and Muslims draw on for their representations. And I have to confess here again, or reiterate the point that I'm new more or less to kind of Jewish visual traditions and iconography, but I can at least parrot what one of the current great art history scholars of Jewish manuscripts has said. Mark Epstein is a professor of religious studies and art history at Vassar College, and he has a series of great books over the last 30 years dealing with a lot of these manuscripts. And he really moves towards that model that there's this pool of imagery, visual imagery, that can mean different things to different audiences. And it's not just a Christian tradition that Jews are appropriating and using subversively, which was his thesis in one book earlier on. In his later books, he comes to see this as a shared visual culture that people can use for their own cases. So I have no doubt that, as you said, there are certain images and aspects of visual traditions that Jews use specifically in their liturgical, literary, exegetical contexts where they're appropriate. But I can't think of a lot of examples only because of my own inexperience, but I can at least point you to this one author, Mark Epstein, who's written great, wonderful books as an art historian and Jewish studies scholar. Yes, please.
Just a footnote to the image of from the Office of the Dead.
Yes,
of
please.
Balance. And the question of, why the figure of death, the skeleton and the woman. I mean, there's a long tradition musically, in English folk song and German lieder of death in the maid. And it culminates in Schubert, obviously, but it goes all the way back into English iconography and English folk singing. So that's a European motif for sure.
Sure.
And I think it makes a great deal of sense that it would end up in the Book of Hours like that, even though that's relatively early. What is that? What
1490.
1490? Yeah, that's pretty early, but I mean, I think that musical motif was already extant at that point.
Yes, so just for the audience who's listening in, the comment was about this, the theme of death and the maiden is much earlier, at least in the Western Christian tradition. My own specialty is 13th and 14th centuries, and so you already see the dance of death, and you already see the three living and the three dead encountering each other in the 13th century in Italy. But I don't doubt that it goes back even further on. But it's so interesting to hear about it, the musical perspective and literary perspective on which a lot of those images are based. But yeah, thank you very much. That's a great comment. I think that in this period, when we approach, at least in this part of the world, what you can call the Renaissance, you start to get the artists much more interested in naturalistic and expressive effects, which I really admire about these bold white highlights that bring out those ribs, or even that kind of wonderful reposoir figure where her body kind of undulates as she tries to escape. But yeah, it's a motif that goes way back, and yeah, thank you. Yes, please, in the back corner.
Why, next over there on the left-hand side, if the Office of the Hours was quoting the psalmist explicitly, why didn't the text itself get into the document?
Great question. That's one of the mysteries of this piece, because in most cases, the text, so the parchment, after it's prepared, is ruled, and then the scribe writes the text and leaves space for images. That is clearly not the case here. By the way, the back is blank, but that's the fact that the back is blank is not a problem. Sometimes miniature paintings were tipped into the manuscript rather than being of a part protocologically. But I don't know why in this case we have the beautiful foliate border and the miniature painting first. This is the right amount of space for the beginning of the text. That's not unusual, the layout. And I have no doubt that it's a 15th century as opposed to a 19th and 20th century manuscript in terms of quality and style. But I don't know. And there's a great book on the evil illuminators and their methods that it dwells on exceptional examples and why they might have occurred like this, and talks about hypotheses. Again, we would just have to speculate. Perhaps this is someone else copying the work of another person, and they were interested in, maybe they had access to a model and they wanted to copy it even before the text was done. time, maybe they're limited by time. But again, we start to create stories in houses of cards if we go too hard. But it doesn't mean that you can't try it. I mean, this is the visual evidence before us and we ought to try. But it's a great point, a great question. Yes, please.
Yeah, I wanted to know if there was any examples of purely illustrative works versus that compared of a combined with text.
In the Jewish visual, Jewish manuscript,
One, Christian or second.
in the Christian medieval tradition.
Can you repeat the question for the people?
Oh, yes. Are there examples of purely visual books or texts in either tradition, secular, religious? That's a great question. I can think of books, 14th century European Christian books, where there's a huge prefatory cycle of images, but there still isn't text later. So let's say 48 full page images, no text. And then later comes the text. I think you've stumped me because I have a feeling that if I were to say no, I would be wrong. But I can't think of an example. There have to have been patrons who just delighted in visual things like Jean-Duc de Berry, who patronized the Limbourg brothers, who at some point probably asked just for visual things, no text. But off the top of my head, I can't think of an example. Certainly, I can't think of one with my limited knowledge of the Jewish visual tradition, but even in the Christian, it's the kind of thing that I should go do a search and credit you.
I'm thinking there has to be because, you know, not everybody is literate, so it depends very heavily on the visual cues.
Absolutely.
Can we take a question from the online folks?
Oh, of course.
Elizabeth Pedikowski asked, who is the audience for the Book of Hours? Who would likely have been the people purchasing or patronizing this?
Okay, so to reiterate the question from the online audience, who's a typical patron for a Book of Hours? So the Book of Hours was the private prayer book for secular figures, for laymen and laywomen. And if we speak about this particular example, I see this painting as of a higher quality than the mass-produced books of hours that were created in this period. There were even printed books of hours. So I would think that this book would have been an upper middle class or an upper class man or woman. More women own books of hours than men, and almost everyone who could afford to have one tried to have one. This was the book. This was the most popular book. This is the book that survives in the most numbers of manuscripts for Christian books in Western and Central Europe during 14th and 15th centuries. And that person, ideally, they would try to use this book every day during the liturgical hours to imitate monks and nuns who were using a breviary within a more monastic context. But they would say fewer prayers and shorter prayers. But it would probably be that kind of person. And with regard to this part of the book, the Office for the Dead, you would be praying for those relatives and friends of yours who had died. And it was thought in this period that every time you did this, every time anyone did this for them, they would have fewer days spent in purgatory. And even though purgatory wasn't kind of officially made official until later on, it was widely believed from the high and late Middle Ages. And so this would really help your deceased loved ones on their way to heaven and salvation that were stuck in that third place. Was there one other question in the back? Oh, sorry.
No, let's take one more from the audience.
Okay, please.
We contrast again the Augustinian friar who
Yes.
was putting himself into that letter. And contrast it with the Jewish artist named Abraham.
Yes.
The Christian illustrator that's a phenomenal piece of art. That is beyond. And the contrast is so stark, it seems to me. The Christian priests, the Catholic priests back in the day, were they getting private art lessons from childhood? Because the Jewish guy, I love him, but that's like first grade stuff. And the guy's got a PhD.
It's, so the question, if I could find a good question, is perhaps about the difference in the quality and the training between this Augustinian friar and this Jewish scribe and illustrator. And it's not fair of me, this comparison. It's not fair of me, but I have to say that the date was too tempting. They're only 4 years apart. And this is actually one of the very first self-portraits in the Western Christian tradition that we have. We have a few scribes who are shown, but we don't think that we think an illuminator, a separate person, made the pictures. So they're not self-portraits, they're just portraits. So I think that Abraham was a wonderful scribe and he could make illustrations, but he probably wasn't his training. In the Western Christian tradition, it was not uncommon within Augustinian, Franciscan, other monastic houses to have a scriptorium. Pavia, by the way, is where the Visconti Dukes of Milan had their castle. So we're talking about the first or second most wealthiest court and religious houses in all of Europe in the late 14th century. So there probably would have been an amazing scriptorium with scribes and illuminators teaching all of the young novitiates and oblates, people who came in early on. So your question's a great one because this person, though we don't know much more about his biography, he could have come as a novitiate or as a young man and been trained, because even though he follows the Augustinian rule, there's a lot of carryover from the Benedictine rule, ora et labora. And so you're going to work in one way or another. You're going to make manuscripts, not just for your own religious community, but you're going to send them out and sell them to make money for your monastery. So it's very possible and likely that he was well trained, and that's why you see this, you can't see it well, but his physiognomy is articulated and there's a beautiful colorful background. I think that Abraham he saw his name and said, why not put myself in it? I mean, this is better than I can do, and I'm at DAAP. Sorry, it's much better than I can do. And I love the detail. He's even wearing the correct pointy shoes that were popular in the late 14th century. And you think of like the Dukes of Burgundy and like he's got the fashion. This is also fashionable to show the legs. And the book is on, I forget the correct chronological word, but the book, this is how books were carried. They had this, there's a knot and then not a string, but a textile material to carry it. I forget how to make sense of this piece. You would carry it from your belt, or you see that in other representations, and then he points to this little kind of flourish that attaches to his name.
Is that a Jewish hat, Professor? It's like classically, can we look at that as something?
Looking at headgear by Jewish artists of Jews, I'm not sure. I would think more it's typical of an artist's hat. But again, we're in a period, in 50 or 75 years, we have artists' self-portraits in scads. But in this period, in the, again, Western Christian tradition, we have one painted self-portrait in the 1390s, and this is more or less the earliest manuscript illumination self-portrait. And so that's why this is just so special. We're in the 14th century, and here we have another example, which is why I'm just surprised it hasn't been kind of published and put into this context, because it's really fantastic. In fact, I need to ask Dr. Finken more about what's being discussed about Abraham, what context this page is in, because I presented here just, I just cut it out and I don't have the full textual context to share with you. Thank you.
All right.